Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Crime Whisper. I know many of you fall asleep to these stories. So before we begin, I'd love for you to drop a comment telling me where you're listening from if you enjoyed tonight's episode. Don't forget to like and subscribe now. Get comfortable, relax, and let's dive into tonight's case story. 1. Imagine loving someone so much you cut off your own family for them, only to end up dead, dismembered, and stuffed into a drum. If that sounds like something from a horror film, know this. It happened to Sarba Rajput, and when the people of Merit learned the truth, they were so outraged, they stormed the police station after the suspects were caught. But how did love curdle into murder? What secrets was Sarba carrying, and who could be cruel enough to turn a romance into a nightmare? Let's rewind and meet the central figures. Muskan Roi was a woman in her early 20s, often described as beautiful, confident, and effortlessly magnetic. Sarba, 10 years her senior at 35, was a former merchant navy officer from a well-to-do family. He'd traveled the world, worked hard, and thought he'd found something real when he met Muskan in 2016, despite their age difference and his family's strong disapproval. Sarba chose Muskan. He broke with his family and married her. They moved into a rented flat in Merit, and in 2019, welcomed a baby girl. Sarba left the merchant navy for a steadier job, so he could be there for his daughter. But the relationship was never smooth. Muskan's feelings shifted. In 2019, she joined a school alumni WhatsApp group and reconnected with an old friend, Sahil Shukla. What began as innocent catching up soon escalated into an affair. The pair also fell into drug use, dragging them deeper into secrecy, obsession, and danger. When Sarba learned of the affair, it destroyed him, so much so that he consulted a lawyer and considered divorce. In 2021, he confronted and even the landlord had witnessed compromising behavior. Still, Sarba's love for his young daughter made him hesitate. He couldn't bring himself to walk away, hoping perhaps that things might mend. In 2023, Sarba accepted a job in London, thinking distance might cool tensions and give Muskan a chance to reconsider. He didn't realize the relationship between Muskan and Sahil would intensify behind his back and become far more sinister. Muskan began manipulating Sahil in a frighteningly calculated way, knowing he was superstitious. She used fake Snapchat accounts, posing as dead relatives, who told Sahil that he and Muskan were destined to be together, and that Sarba had to be removed for that destiny to come true. By November 2023, they were plotting murder. This was not passion. It was cold, planned, and methodical. The plot moved from talk to action on March 4, 2025. That day, Sarba returned home carrying a plate his mother had prepared, an ordinary, comforting meal that would become the first step toward his horrific end. Muskan reheated the food and laced it with sedatives. The plan had begun, and everything that followed would tear a family apart and shock an entire community. The husband's fate was sealed soon after eating. Sarba began to feel the sedatives taking hold. His body grew weak, his vision blurred, and within minutes, he was slipping into unconsciousness as he struggled to stay awake. Muskin didn't hesitate. She immediately called Sahil her lover, her accomplice, and the other half of this dark plan, urging him to come over. Sahil, who had been waiting for this very moment, made his way to the house in the Indranagar area of Meerut. What happened next was nothing short of monstrous. When Sahil arrived, the two carried out their long-planned crime. They attacked Sarba without mercy. The post-mortem report later revealed that he was stabbed 3 times, directly in the heart, each blow so violent that it punctured the organ, causing massive internal bleeding. But the brutality didn't end there. To make sure he was truly gone, Muskan and Sahil went even further in a horrifying twist. They severed Sarba's head and cut off his hands. His legs were bent unnaturally, contorted backward, an attempt to force his body into a drum. It was an act of sheer savagery, the kind of scene that scars everyone who hears about it even after the murder. Their cruelty continued. They stuffed the dismembered remains into a large plastic drum filled it with cement, and sealed it shut, as if trying to bury not just a body, but the evidence of their inhumanity for weeks. The drum sat hidden until March 18th, when police began investigating Saraba's disappearance. What they discovered beneath the layers of concrete shocked even the most seasoned. Officers' news of the murder spread like wildfire. The people of Mirat were horrified. Neighbors who had seen the couple smiling days before couldn't comprehend the nightmare that had been unfolding next door. Suspicion quickly turned toward Muskin, especially after her sudden disappearance and the odd timing of her vacation. It didn't take long for police to connect the dots and realize she wasn't alone. Sahil was missing too. Just one day after the murder, on March 5th, the pair were spotted together, showing no signs of guilt or fear. Instead of lying low, they acted as though life had simply gone on. On March 10th, they checked into a hotel in Kasali, Himachal Pradesh, using fake identities there. They celebrated Holi, drank, and danced at a nightclub, all while the body of the man they'd murdered was hardening in a drum back home. But their escape wasn't as smooth as they thought. Hotel staff soon found their behavior odd. They rarely left their room, avoided contact with others, and told the cleaning staff not to enter. It was as if they were trying to erase every trace of their existence when their money began to run out. They had no choice but to return to Mirat on March 16th. By then, police had pieced together most of the puzzle: the couple's strange behavior, their sudden trip, and the growing inconsistencies in their stories led investigators straight to them. Their arrest would reveal something even darker: that the real mastermind wasn't Sahil at all. New evidence showed that Muskin had orchestrated everything. She wasn't a manipulated lover. She was the manipulator in a shocking twist. It came to light that she had exploited Sahil's deep-rooted belief in the supernatural to control him completely using her brother's phone. She created several fake Snapchat accounts, one of which pretended to be Sahil's dead mother. Through these fake messages, she convinced Sahil that spirits from the afterlife wanted him and Muskin to be together, but only if Saraba was gone. The fabricated spirit even sent him messages dripping with eerie persuasion. One of them, allegedly from his mother's ghostly persona, read, "Raja, my child, forgive us. We won't come to speak to you again. Whatever must happen now will happen. The path has been chosen." It was a chilling lie, one that blurred the line between superstition and madness, and ultimately pushed Sahil to cross the point of no return. After Nicole's marriage, life in the quiet town of Besson seemed peaceful again, at least on the surface. But beneath that calm, something dark was brewing. Something that would soon turn an ordinary September night into one of the most horrific massacres in Illinois history. It was September 21st, 2009. Rick and Ruth G had spent the evening just like any other dinner. Some TV. Putting the kids to bed, the family dog barked a few times before the night grew quiet in their modest home. 6 people drifted off to sleep, unaware that a monster was about to walk through their door sometime after midnight. 25-year-old Christopher Harris, the same man who had once been welcomed into the G family as Nicole's husband broke into their home. What happened next would scar Beeson forever. Christopher's motive remains debated to this day. Some believe he was fueled by rage after his marriage to Nicole fell apart. Others say drugs twisted his mind beyond reason. But whatever the reason, what he did next was pure evil. He crept through the house in the dark, armed with a tire iron. His first victim was Rick G himself. Struck repeatedly as he slept, the sound of the blows echoed through the hallway. Waking others, Ruth came running, screaming, only to be met with the same brutal fate. Then, one by one, he turned on the children. 3-year-old Justina, 1-year-old Dylan, 10-year-old Austin. None were spared. Even the family dog was beaten to death. The attack was so savage that investigators later said the crime scene was something out of a nightmare. Blood covered the walls, ceilings, and floors. A massacre so intense that veteran detectives had to step outside to compose themselves. The only survivor was Rick's teenage daughter, Nicole, Christopher's estranged wife, who wasn't home that night when she learned what happened. She collapsed in disbelief. She had loved this man, she had trusted him, and now he had wiped out her entire family for 2 days. Police and volunteers searched tirelessly for clues then, thanks to a tip. Christopher Harris and his brother Jason were arrested during interrogation. Christopher tried to shift blame, spinning bizarre stories about intruders and self-defense, but the physical evidence told a different story. Fingerprints, footprints, and DNA left behind during the frenzy. Prosecutors painted a horrifying picture of what really happened. Christopher Harris, enraged and obsessed, broke into his former in-laws' home and slaughtered them all before fleeing. The brutality was so shocking that the media dubbed it the Beeson bloodbath in court. Christopher showed little emotion. He listened coldly as prosecutors described how he crushed skulls and bludgeoned children when the verdict was read, guilty on all counts. The courtroom fell silent. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge called it one of the most senseless acts of violence ever seen in this state to this day. The town of Besson hasn't forgotten. The G family's home was torn down shortly after the trial, too haunted by what happened to remain standing. Locals still talk about that night in hushed tones, remembering the family that once filled the quiet town with laughter, now reduced to a tragic memory. And so ends this chilling story, a reminder that sometimes the greatest horrors aren't born of strangers in the dark, but from those we once called family. Pipes on both sides and a loud engine. A description that immediately caught investigators' attention. They knew that Chris Harris, Nicole's husband, drove a silver pickup fitting that same description at first. Police didn't want to jump to conclusions. They wanted solid evidence before accusing anyone, especially the son-in-law of the murdered family. But as the hours went by, the pieces slowly started to fall into place, and they pointed toward Chris. Meanwhile, at the hospital, little Tabitha was fighting for her life. Doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize her. She had deep cuts, head trauma, and a skull fracture. Everyone wondered how a 3-year-old could have survived such horror. But as detectives would later learn, her survival would become the key to unraveling this case. Back at the crime scene, forensic teams gathered everything they could: blood samples, hair, fibers, and even fingerprints. The brutality of the murders suggested someone filled with rage and possibly under the influence of drugs or alcohol. But there was no sign of forced entry, which meant the killer was likely someone the G family trusted. Investigators then turned their focus to the timeline. Rick and Ruth were last seen alive on the evening of September 20th, 2009. They had dinner at home with their kids, Dylan, Austin, Justina, and little Tabitha. Nicole had spoken to her mom briefly on the phone that night, and everything seemed fine then. Sometime between midnight and dawn, their quiet home turned into a nightmare while detectives processed the scene. They received word from the hospital that Tabitha had regained partial consciousness. A nurse said she had whispered a few words before drifting off again, something about Chris and fighting. The investigators froze. Could a 3-year-old really be identifying her own father as the killer? Detectives immediately began digging into Chris Harris's background. What they found was troubling. Chris and Nicole's marriage had been rocky for months. He had lost his job earlier that summer and had been drinking heavily. Friends said he'd grown short-tempered and often lashed out. In fact, one neighbor recalled hearing arguments between him and Nicole, loud enough to echo down the street. When investigators sat down to interview Chris, he appeared nervous but tried to play it cool. He claimed he had been out drinking with his brother, Jason Harris, the night of the murders, and had no idea what had happened until he got the call. But police noticed small details that didn't line up: a scratch on his neck, bruises on his arms, and a small cut on his hand. When asked how he got them, he said he fell the next day. Forensic tests came back from the lab. Blood found on a pair of shoes in Chris's truck matched Rick and Dylan. That was enough for detectives to bring him back in for questioning this time. as a suspect at first. Chris stuck to his story, but when investigators revealed the blood evidence, his composure cracked. He tried to change his account, saying he had gone to the G's house to talk things out, and that he'd been attacked by Dylan. He claimed he only fought back in self-defense, but this didn't explain why 4 other family members, including 2 children, were brutally murdered while they slept. Then came the most chilling revelation. Investigators discovered that Chris had tried to visit Tabitha at the hospital twice after the murders. Even before detectives had spoken to him, nurses recalled, he seemed agitated, pacing and demanding to see her when denied entry. He left angrily. Police believed he was trying to make sure Tabitha couldn't tell anyone what she saw that night. As detectives pieced everything together, they realized the truth was far darker than they'd imagined. Chris Harris hadn't just snapped in a moment of rage. This was personal, and when the full story finally came out, it would shock even the most seasoned investigators. Nichols' post quickly spread through the small Illinois community, fueling debate and division. Some sympathized with her. After all, she'd just lost her parents, siblings, and nearly her daughter. Others, though, weren't convinced. The timing, the evidence, and the odd behavior from Chris made them uneasy. Detectives, meanwhile, were not swayed by emotion. They continued digging deeper into Chris and Jason's story. According to the brothers, they'd been out drinking late into the night of September 20th and returned home to Jason's place, where they both crashed. But when investigators reviewed security footage from nearby businesses and spoke with witnesses, cracks in their story began to show. One clerk recalled seeing 2 men who looked like the Harris brothers leaving a convenience store near Beeson, just miles from the G family's home. Around 10:30 p.m. police quietly began building their case, but they needed more than suspicion. Then, a small but critical discovery changed everything. Forensic experts found a partial palm print in blood on the G family's bathroom door, and when the lab results came back, it was a match to Chris Harris. That was the confirmation investigators needed. On October 14, 2009, just over 3 weeks after the massacre, police arrested Christopher Harris and charged him with 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder for the attack on Little Tabitha. Nichol was in disbelief. She broke down when police told her, insisting that Chris couldn't have done it. He loved my family. She kept saying he would never hurt them, but detectives had seen it too many times before. Someone so close to the victims, acting normal, even supportive, only to be hiding a horrifying secret. During questioning, Chris stuck to his story. He admitted being near the G home that night, but claimed it was for an innocent reason. He said he'd gone there to talk with Justina, Rick and Ruth's teenage daughter, about some family issues. But his story quickly took a darker turn when detectives pressed harder. Chris claimed he had walked in on 14-year-old Dylan attacking his own family. He insisted that Dylan had snapped and killed everyone, and that Chris, had only fought with Dylan in self-defense. It was a shocking claim, and to many investigators, it was also completely unbelievable. The idea that a 14-year-old could single-handedly overpower and murder 4 adults and siblings, leaving no defensive wounds consistent with a struggle, made no sense, and forensic evidence didn't support it. Dylan's injuries showed he had fought desperately to survive, not that he was the aggressor. Forensic testing on Chris's clothing revealed tiny blood spatter patterns that were consistent with someone striking victims at close range, not merely defending themselves. The case began to build momentum. Prosecutors argued that Chris had gone to the G home that night after drinking heavily with his brother. He was angry, possibly jealous, and took out his rage on the family. They believed the attack began with Rick and Ruth, before moving down the hall, bludgeoning each of the children as they tried to escape or hide. The weapon was never definitively recovered, but experts concluded it was likely a tire iron or similar blunt object as the evidence mounted. Jason Harris also found himself under scrutiny. Detectives suspected he knew far more than he was letting on. Eventually, in exchange for immunity, Jason admitted that Chris had returned to his house early that morning looking disheveled and covered in what looked like blood. Jason said he helped him wash up and get rid of some clothing, but claimed he didn't know what Chris had done until later. Years later, when the trial finally began in 2013, the courtroom was packed. Nicole, who had initially defended Chris fiercely, now sat silently, her expression hardened by years of grief and betrayal. Prosecutors presented forensic photos, autopsy reports, and Chris's shifting stories, but the most powerful moment came when Tabitha, now older and partially recovered, took the stand. Her voice was small and trembling as she described seeing Daddy fighting and then Daddy hitting. Though she couldn't remember every detail, her words were enough to seal the image in the jury's mind. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 7 hours. They found Christopher Harris guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 5 life terms without the possibility of parole, one for each of the lives he brutally took. Heartbroken, later said she felt like she'd lost her family twice, once to the murders, and again to the truth. The community of Besson never forgot that night for years. The house where the G family lived stood empty, a grim reminder of the horror that had unfolded within its walls. Eventually, it was torn down, but for those who remembered Rick, Ruth, Dylan, Justina, and Austin, the scars would never truly fade. Jason claimed that after Lori Cole turned Chris away, they drove aimlessly through the quiet back roads, both of them intoxicated and high. Chris was restless, agitated, and obsessed with the idea of finding a woman that night. According to Jason, Chris started talking about Justina G., the 16-year-old daughter of his in-law, saying she'd been flirty with him before. Jason insisted he wanted no part of it, but Chris was persistent. He drove toward the G family's house, telling his brother to wait in the truck while he talked to Justina. Jason said he stayed behind, parked near the end of the driveway. Minutes passed. Then he heard noises, thuds, shouting, and glass breaking. When he stepped out to look, he claimed he saw Chris inside, swinging something repeatedly. Jason said he panicked and ran up to the porch, but by the time he reached the door, it was too late. The scene inside was beyond comprehension. Chaos, blood and movement everywhere, he said. Chris looked wild, out of control, and covered in blood. Jason claimed he shouted at his brother to stop, but Chris turned to him and yelled, "They're all dead now. We have to go." Terrified, Jason said he stumbled back to the truck and waited, shaking, while Chris grabbed a few things from the house and returned moments later, breathing heavily and soaked in blood. The two then sped away into the night, saying little to each other. Jason said he wanted to go to the police immediately, but was afraid of being blamed, afraid of his brother. When they reached his house, Chris washed up, changed clothes, and told Jason to get rid of his old ones out of fear and confusion. Jason did what he was told. He threw the clothes into a creek near his property, the same place investigators later found a tire iron believed to be the murder weapon. Though Jason's story changed multiple times, one thing never wavered: his insistence that Chris alone carried out the killings. Prosecutors would later use Jason's testimony, along with forensic evidence and Chris's own inconsistencies, to piece together a chilling picture of that night's events in a small corner of the town park, a quiet, colorful place meant to replace the darkness that had once swallowed their home. It became a symbol of resilience, a promise that the G family would never be forgotten. Every year, flowers and balloons appear at that playground, left by neighbors and classmates who still remember the laughter that once filled the G household. As for Christopher Harris, he remains behind bars, serving his multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. A grim end to a man who tore apart not only one family, but an entire community's sense of safety. He continues to deny his guilt to this day, claiming he was framed and insisting that his brother Jason fabricated the story to save himself. But with overwhelming forensic evidence, the DNA, the palm print, the recovered murder weapon, the court's verdict left little room for doubt. Jason Harris, meanwhile, completed his reduced sentence, and was released after serving nearly a decade. He's kept a low profile ever since, reportedly living under a different name. His cooperation may have helped convict his brother, but in the eyes of many, his silence that night made him complicit. Tabitha, the sole survivor, is now a young woman, though her early years were defined by unimaginable trauma. Those who know her describe her as bright, strong, and full of life in interviews. She rarely speaks about that night, not because she doesn't remember, but because she's learned to focus on the love that came after. Nicole, who raised her, has done everything possible to give her sister a normal, peaceful life for the people of Bonn, Illinois. The tragedy of 2009 will always be a scar, a haunting reminder of how evil can hide behind familiar faces. The G family's story, however, has become more than a tale of horror. It's a story of survival, community, and the quiet courage of a little girl who endured what no child should ever face and still found a way to live. A game portrait of a teenage mind gone completely off the rails. The last confirmed activity from Nicky's phone was on February 13th, just one day after he disappeared from school. After that, it went dark, powered off, or intentionally destroyed, but digital forensics gave detectives another way in. Donald's phone, even though it had been turned off after the murders, investigators were able to pull deleted messages and data fragments. What they found shocked everyone. In the days leading up to February 11th, Nicky had been visiting online forums filled with white supremacist propaganda and conspiracy theories. He'd joined a private Discord server with members who discussed restoring America through cleansing, a phrase that would later become a focal point of the investigation. He wasn't just a passive participant either. He posted under the name Pureblood17, ranting about eliminating the traitors in power, and even mentioning the sitting president by name in one of his final messages. Nicky wrote, "The system is infected. I'll make history by cleaning my own house first." Investigators also found that Nicky had purchased ammunition online using a prepaid card. The order was placed just 3 days before the murders. His search history included phrases like "how to silence a gunshot" and "how long can a body decompose indoors before smell spreads." When police canvassed the area, several neighbors remembered seeing Nicky in the early mornings after his disappearance. One said he was spotted walking down the road with a backpack and the family's dog. Toby, another, saw him at a local gas station, buying canned food and a map of the Midwest. He didn't look frantic or scared, just calm, composed, and eerily detached. By now, authorities believed Nicky had killed his parents sometime between February 12th and 13th. But why? Why would a 17-year-old kid murder the two people who raised and supported him? The answer came when detectives uncovered a handwritten manifesto in Donald's office drawer. It was written on lined notebook paper, filled with crude drawings and lists. The first page read, Phase 1, purge the weakness. Phase 2, clean the house. Phase 3, restore America. Throughout the pages, he described himself as a soldier for the white race, and claimed his parents had betrayed their bloodline by supporting liberal lies. In one chilling paragraph, Nicky wrote, "They sleep peacefully in the house of sheep. I'll wake them with fire and thunder." He had written that days before pulling the trigger. The manhunt for Nicky spread statewide. His mother's BMW had been found abandoned in a parking garage near Milwaukee. Surveillance footage showed him calmly parking the car, locking it, and walking away with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. 2 days later, he appeared on another camera, this time at a gun store 60 miles north, where he tried to buy more ammunition, but was refused for being underage. That footage would be the last known sighting of him. Then, in early March, a break came. The FBI traced a credit card transaction from a convenience store near Appleton, Wisconsin. A young man matching Nicky's description had bought camping supplies, bottled water, and a burner phone. Agents moved quickly, combing through nearby woods and abandoned cabins. On March 5, 2025, They found him. Nikki was hiding in a hunting cabin roughly 80 miles north of Wauwatosa, Toby. The family dog was still with him, thin, scared, but alive inside the cabin. Officers discovered 2 handguns, a laptop, and a detailed map with routes drawn toward Washington, D.C. across the top of the map. He'd written in black marker, "Final March." Nikki surrendered without resistance when asked why he did it. He said something that made every officer in the room go cold, because someone had to start the war during interrogation. Nikki claimed his parents were part of the problem, that they were polluted by lies, and that by killing them, he was purifying himself. He even admitted to sleeping next to their bodies for several days afterward, saying he didn't feel disgusted, only closer to them now that they were pure. At trial, prosecutors painted him as a delusional extremist, driven by hate and fantasy. His defense argued mental illness, claiming Nikki had suffered from untreated schizophrenia, worsened by online radicalization, but the evidence was overwhelming. The manifesto, the ballistic match to his father's gun, and the digital trail that proved premeditation. In December 2025, the jury found Nikki Kasap guilty on all counts. 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, and 1 count of animal cruelty for the abuse Toby suffered during their flight. He was sentenced to life in prison, without parole. The judge called it one of the most chilling, senseless acts of domestic terror the state had ever seen. As for Toby, he was adopted by one of the lead detectives, and now lives on a small farm outside Milwaukee, a quiet, happy life, far from the horrors of that February night. And the town of Wauwatosa, it still hasn't fully healed. A once ordinary suburban street now carries a memory that will never fade, a reminder of how quickly darkness can grow in even the most peaceful place. Creepiness didn't stop there. Witness A told investigators that Nikki's behavior began to grow darker and more obsessive over time. What started as uncomfortable flirting quickly turned into disturbing, unsolicited messages, images of war, violence, and death. He would send her gore edits he'd made himself, blending footage of real killings with patriotic Russian music and propaganda quotes. She said it was like he wanted to shock people, to make them see the world the way he did, violent, chaotic, and ruled by power. He'd message her late at night, saying things like, "You don't understand what's coming," or "America will fall, and I'll be part of it." Sometimes he'd even send cryptic selfies, standing in front of a mirror wearing tactical gloves, his face half covered by a mask, holding a pistol. According to Witness A, he began insisting that she should join the cause, claiming he was working with powerful people overseas who were preparing for a purge. She told detectives she tried to block him, but he always found new accounts to contact her, from Instagram, Snapchat, Telegram, even an old email address. At one point, he sent her a video of himself firing a gun into a forest, saying, "Practice makes perfect." That was just weeks before the murder. It became painfully clear that Nikita's obsession wasn't just ideological, it was personal, possessive, and predatory. Witness A said she reported his harassment to school staff once, but they dismissed it as teen drama. Nobody imagined he was capable of something like this. After his arrest, investigators uncovered hundreds of saved files on his laptop, propaganda videos, extremist manifestos, and private chat logs between him and multiple online users linked to extremist circles. In these conversations, Nikita referred to himself as the Awake. He bragged about his mission, talked about cleansing weak blood, and described the murders of his parents as a test of strength. Each message painted the same picture: a young man completely consumed by delusion and hate, spiraling deeper into an echo chamber of online extremism, until it finally burst into real-world violence. The beginning of this so-called revolution, according to prosecutors. The evidence suggested that Nikita wasn't acting out of impulse. He was executing the first step of a larger, terrifying plan. The manifesto detailed his belief in purification through destruction, describing his parents as traitors to the cause for embracing American ideals. He wrote that their deaths were necessary sacrifices to finance his mission to awaken the nation. Investigators revealed that Nikita had communicated with several online contacts connected to extremist channels on Telegram. These users, some traced back to Europe and Russia, encouraged his violent ideas, feeding into his delusions of grandeur. One message read, "You must prove yourself through blood before you lead." Prosecutors believe this message was the final push that led Nikita to pull the trigger in his manifesto, which spanned over 40 pages. Nikita described in chilling detail how he believed the United States was rotting from within. He claimed that modern society had become soft, weak, and poisoned by democracy, and that only violent revolution could restore order. He even outlined plans for infiltration of political events and an assassination plot targeting President Trump, calling it the spark that will ignite the war. Federal agents took these writings extremely seriously. The FBI, Secret Service, and Department of Homeland Security all became involved in the investigation once the assassination plot surfaced in a joint statement. Officials confirmed that Nikita had made credible threats and that his communications showed intent, ideology, and capacity for violence. Back in Wisconsin, the community of Wauwatosa was left reeling. Parents who once waved to Nikita as he rode his bike down the street now struggled to reconcile the quiet honor student they remembered with the monster described in court. Neighbors who attended the vigil for Tatiana and Donald described them as gentle, loving people who worked hard and adored their son. The idea that their child could have plotted their deaths in cold blood shattered the illusion of safety in their suburban neighborhood. As for Nikita, he's shown little emotion in court appearances, dressed in a county jail uniform. He rarely looks up, often staring blankly at the table in front of him. During one hearing, when the prosecutor described the photos found on his memory card, Nikita reportedly smirked, a gesture that sent a wave of disgust through the courtroom. The prosecution's case is overwhelming. Forensic evidence, digital trails, financial transactions, and that haunting manifesto all paint a picture of a young man consumed by ideology and hatred. His defense team, however, is expected to argue that he suffers from severe mental illness, that he was manipulated by extremist propaganda online, and lost his grip on reality. But for many, no explanation will ever be enough. 2 innocent lives were taken, a peaceful neighborhood was shaken to its core, and a once promising teen transformed into something far darker. The trial approaches on May 7, 2025. The nation watches closely. The case of State versus Nikita Kasa isn't just about one boy's descent into madness. It's a chilling reminder of how digital radicalization can twist the mind of even the most ordinary person into something unrecognizably fiend. Means an autonomy to bring his dark ambitions to life. The teenager now faces first-degree murder charges and is set to be arraigned on May 7th. But what makes this case so deeply disturbing isn't just the brutality of the act, it's how someone so young, barely out of adolescence, could be drawn so effortlessly into the world of violent extremism. One of the most unsettling pieces of evidence comes from a string of messages Nikki exchanged with a man on Telegram. In them, Nikki openly entertains the idea of fleeing to Ukraine, questioning whether he could escape justice there. At one point, he wrote chillingly, "So while in Ukraine, I'll be able to live a normal life, even when it's found out I did it." Those words reveal a shocking level of detachment, an eerie calmness in the face of his own monstrous actions. What's even more disturbing is how he acknowledges, almost casually, that the truth would eventually come out. He wasn't delusional about getting away with it. He knew he'd be caught. He just wanted to escape the aftermath of a stranger. Nikki never tried to frame anyone else. There was no attempt to shift blame, no fake alibi, no story to cover his tracks. It's as if he fully accepted the weight of what he'd done, coldly and deliberately. And that's what makes this crime feel so chillingly calculated now. A cloud of speculation hangs over whether Nikki's parents might have suspected something before their deaths. especially his alleged obsession with overthrowing the US government. Some believe they sensed a shift in his behavior, small warning signs that something wasn't right. One particularly haunting detail comes from Donald Meyer's mother, Judith, who later revealed that her son had sent her strange, cryptic texts shortly before he stopped responding altogether. They weren't his usual check-ins. They were vague, uneasy messages that hinted something was wrong, but at the time, she had no idea just how serious it was. So, what if his parents did know? What if they started putting the pieces together, noticing his fixation on extremist ideologies, maybe even confronting him about his radical beliefs? According to some theories, that might be exactly why Nicky targeted them first, to silence the only people who could expose him. Think about it, his parents were the ones with access to the family's money, the house, and even the revolver later used in the murders. Maybe Nicky saw them as obstacles, the final barrier standing between him and the twisted vision he was desperate to bring to life. And so, with chilling calculation, he removed them from the equation filled her feed, picture after picture of selfies, always dressed to impress, showing off her confidence and flair for style, but beneath the curated images and perfectly chosen filters, one recurring theme stood out: her love for her boys. Time and again, her posts showed joyful moments with Jaden and Morris, laughing, hugging, smiling to anyone scrolling by. It looked like she was doing everything she could to give her children a happy, stable life, but behind the emojis and photo filters was a woman quietly falling apart. Tiffany's early adult years were a mix of ambition and adversity. She dreamed big, first chasing a career in modeling before diving into entrepreneurship in 2016. She launched Miss Tiff's One-Stop Shop, a small convenience store that sold food, tobacco, and everyday essentials. It was a bold step, one that reflected her determination to build something on her own terms. But by 2017, the dream collapsed. The store shut down permanently. In a resurfaced interview, Tiffany blamed part of the failure on a Walmart that was supposed to open nearby but never did, a lost opportunity that hit her finances hard. And after that, life seemed to start closing in on her. 2018, Tiffany found herself in legal trouble, arrested on drug possession charges. She later pled guilty and spent 30 days in jail. Court records showed no signs of violence or instability, just a single lapse in an otherwise uneventful record. After her release, she seemed determined to move on. No more arrests, no public drama, just a woman trying to rebuild quietly. She took an overnight job. The details were never fully clear, and for a time, it seemed like she was finding her footing again. But life has a cruel way of breaking even the strongest spirits. On January 1st, 2019, tragedy struck. Her father, 47-year-old John Lucas, died suddenly. For Tiffany, it was as if her entire world crumbled overnight. Her father wasn't just family. He was her anchor, the one constant source of love, guidance, and strength in her life. His death left a void she couldn't fill. Tiffany shared her grief in a raw, emotional Facebook video, her pain palpable as she struggled to make sense of the loss. The woman who once smiled brightly for the camera now looked shattered. She tried to hold it together for her boys, but something deep inside her had broken. The light in her eyes was gone, replaced by an emptiness she couldn't hide in. If you think losing her father was the moment everything fell apart, it was only the beginning. Just 7 months later, another devastating blow. Daryl Howard, the father of one of her sons, was murdered. Still reeling from her father's death, Tiffany now had to face yet another loss, another hole ripped into her already fragile world. The case remains an open homicide investigation by the Louisville Metro Police Department. But for Tiffany, the damage was done, and then came another heartbreak within a year. Tiffany's mother suffered a severe stroke and was diagnosed with a brain tumor. The hits kept coming. Father gone, child's father murdered, mother gravely ill. Everything and everyone Tiffany loved seemed to be slipping away. one by one, as if the emotional toll wasn't enough. Tiffany's financial situation began to collapse by November 8th, the day everything changed. She was barely hanging on. Her utilities had been shut off. No electricity, no running water, and sitting on the kitchen counter was an eviction notice. A cold reminder that she was on the brink of losing her home for most. An eviction notice is just paper, but for Tiffany, a grieving, exhausted mother trying to hold her life together, it was the breaking point. It wasn't just about losing a roof. It was about losing control, fear, anxiety, shame. It all came crashing down. The fear of not being able to provide, the guilt of failing her children. The crushing weight of a society that tells mothers they must be strong, even when their world is burning around them. That pressure to keep smiling, to keep surviving, became unbearable. Around you crumbles. It's unimaginable, and all of those struggles, the unbearable grief, relentless hardship, and suffocating fear, they all came crashing down on November 8th, 2023, that day. The facade of a peaceful Kentucky suburb shattered, leaving behind a crime so horrifying that even seasoned deputies struggled to process what they saw. The tragedy unfolded inside what looked like an ordinary, cozy home on Bentwood Drive in Shepherdsville, the kind of quiet neighborhood where the grass is neatly cut, kids play outside, and neighbors wave as they drive by. A place that seemed safe, but on that morning, it became a scene straight out of a nightmare. A responding deputy later said, "There was no way anyone could have survived what happened in there, not even adults yet." Miraculously, when first responders arrived, Tiffany's two young sons, just 9 and 6 years old, were still alive, though barely. Both had been shot in areas that doctors later described as unsurvivable. They were rushed to Norton Children's Hospital in Louisville, where doctors fought desperately to save them, but within hours, both boys were gone. To understand how it reached that point, we need to rewind just one day earlier. The evening of November 7th, neighbors recalled seeing Tiffany outside her home acting strangely. One neighbor described her as agitated, furiously scrubbing her carpet, her face tight and anxious. When asked if she was all right, Tiffany gave only a vague answer. "There's a lot going on." It was a cryptic response, one that would soon haunt everyone on that street the next morning. At around 11 a.m., the peaceful calm of Bentwood Drive was shattered by a desperate cry for help. Tiffany burst from her front door, running toward a neighbor's house, screaming, "Help, my kids are dying." She collapsed on their driveway. Trembling and hysterical, the neighbor's husband ran into Tiffany's home, and what he found would stay with him forever. Inside the living room lay Jaden and Maurice, gravely wounded, their small bodies soaked in blood. A handgun was nearby, believed to be the weapon used. A man called 911, begging for an ambulance when first responders entered. Even the most experienced officers froze at the sight. One investigator later described it as the most heartbreaking scene of my career. The boys were rushed to the hospital, but both succumbed to their injuries soon after arrival. The community was left reeling. How could something so horrific happen here in a home that, until that morning, looked like every other in town? How could a mother, someone who, by all appearances, adored her children, be responsible for something so unthinkable? Within an hour of the boys' deaths, Tiffany was taken into custody at the Bullitt County EMS facility. She was charged with 2 counts of murder and held on a $2 million bond. Body cam footage from that day showed a completely different woman than the Tiffany people thought they knew. Gone was the vibrant, smiling mother from Facebook, replaced by someone broken, frantic, and eerily detached. Her face was pale, her voice trembling, her eyes unfocused. The footage was raw and haunting, showing a woman consumed by something beyond simple despair, something darker. And then came the question that gripped investigators, psychologists, and the entire community. Why? Was it the crushing financial pressure, the eviction notice, the mounting despair, or something else entirely? At first, Detectives leaned toward the financial motive. Tiffany had been struggling working nights, raising 2 kids alone, facing eviction, and feeling like her world was collapsing. But as one investigator put it, millions of parents face hardship, they don't do this. And then, a chilling revelation emerged during a 3-hour interrogation with Detective Bell. Tiffany made a bizarre and disturbing claim that she had been manipulated into the crime by someone on Facebook. She told detectives that she believed she was being controlled, persuaded, or coerced by an unknown individual. Online. Detective Bell later testified that her statements were scattered, paranoid, and inconsistent. She spoke about messages and voices, about spiritual manipulation, and unseen forces influencing her actions. It was as if she genuinely believed she hadn't acted on her own will. But was this a desperate attempt to justify the unjustifiable, or a window into a mind that had completely unraveled? There was no clear reasoning behind Tiffany's actions, just scattered thoughts and fragments of delusion. She told investigators the shooting was an accident, full of regret and panic, muttering, "I'm so stupid, I'm in such a bad spot." Yet, even as she expressed remorse, she seemed desperate to separate herself from responsibility, claiming she had been manipulated. According to reports from WDRB, Detective Bael testified in court that Tiffany said, "I would never do anything like this unless someone manipulated me." She went on to make an eerie claim that she had been influenced through Facebook, Wi-Fi, and the internet itself. The bizarre statement raised even more questions about her mental state and what forces, real or imagined, might have been controlling her. Her claim left investigators and the public deeply unsettled. She never explained what kind of manipulation she meant. Was she suggesting an online conspiracy? Had she fallen into the kind of dangerous digital echo chambers that prey on unstable minds? Maybe something like QAnon or similar extremist movements? Or was it the manifestation of a full-blown mental breakdown? Sadly, this wouldn't be the first time someone consumed by toxic online content spiraled into delusion and violence. So while Tiffany's story sounds far-fetched, it wasn't entirely impossible, especially considering what happened in the days leading up to the murders. Everything seemed to unravel on November 7, 2023. Ring doorbell footage from a neighbor's home showed Tiffany standing on their porch, clutching her dog. Blue. What followed was deeply unsettling. She went off on a strange emotional rant, pleading with the neighbor to be an anchor in her life, and claiming she'd been talking to God. She spoke erratically, telling her dog not to bark, and insisting that this was her friend's house, even calling it her house, as if she genuinely believed she belonged there. It was rambling, confused, and deeply alarming behavior that left the neighbors shaken. Later that same day, Tiffany was spotted at a Waffle House with her 2 sons. To anyone watching the boys, it looked like a normal family moment. They were laughing, cracking jokes, and smiling, but Tiffany seemed detached from reality. One server said she kept staring into space, glancing nervously over her shoulder, as if someone was following her. Another recalled that she didn't speak a single word during the meal. When it came time to pay, her hands shook uncontrollably, and she suddenly burst into tears. Looking back, the staff now believes she might have been silently crying out for help. They just didn't recognize it at the time. The very next day, November 8th, everything exploded. Neighbor called 911 after hearing gunshots from Tiffany's home. More Ring footage captured her moments later, crying and begging for help at another neighbor's door. When officers arrived, they found her lying face down in the driveway, sobbing. "My sons are dying." Body cam footage showed her dazed and disoriented. She told police, "I don't feel right," but appeared uninjured. Inside the home, officers discovered a scene too horrific to describe. Tiffany was charged with 2 counts of capital murder. At first, she pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming she had suffered a complete psychotic break, that she genuinely believed she was protecting her sons from something inhuman. Her attorney argued that Tiffany had been detoxing from drugs, and that the breakdown was part of her withdrawal. Symptoms, he added that she adored her boys and couldn't imagine life without them. In fact, he said, she even tried to turn the gun on herself afterward, but the weapon jammed. Then came one of the most frustrating revelations in the case. When Tiffany was booked into jail, no one administered a drug test, no blood work, number toxicology, nothing for such a critical case, where her mental state was the central question. This oversight was baffling. Tiffany's trial was initially set for December 2024, but before it began, she changed her plea to guilty. With no apparent deal on the table, it seemed she simply threw herself at the mercy of the court, possibly realizing there was no escaping conviction by waiving a jury. She allowed the judge alone to decide her fate, a move that might have spared her from an even harsher outcome during sentencing. Both sides made their arguments. The defense leaned on the insanity narrative, replaying footage of her breakdowns, the doorbell clip, and the eerie silence at the Waffle House, to show a woman spiraling out of touch with reality. Then came the heartbreaking testimony. 6 family members took the stand, their voices breaking as they spoke. One of the most gut-wrenching statements came from Maurice's father, who could barely hold back tears. He told the court that Jaden, his son with Tiffany, was all he had left after already losing one child. And then Tiffany took Jaden, too. He said he had begged her for custody again and again, warning anyone who would listen about her instability, her drug use, her erratic behavior, the unsafe environment she was raising the boys in. I called everyone, he said, my family, her family, anyone who could help. Through tears, he told the court, I didn't just lose my son on November 8th, I lost him the day he was born, because from that moment on, I was always fighting to save him. Despite the heart-wrenching testimonies from the family, the judge ultimately delivered his decision. 2 life sentences. He spoke firmly, his words cutting through the silence of the courtroom. He reminded everyone that motherhood isn't just about bringing life into the world, it's about protecting that life, nurturing it with love and safety. I can't begin to imagine, he said, the terror those boys must have felt, seeing their own mother holding a gun. He paused before adding that the thought of the second child hearing the gunshot that killed his brother was simply unbearable. Tiffany was sentenced to life in prison on both counts of murder. However, under Kentucky law, she will technically be eligible for parole after 20 years, a detail that left the victim's family furious. The prosecution insisted that parole was unlikely, but for the family, even the slightest chance felt like an injustice. Outside the courthouse, one of the boy's aunts spoke with fierce emotion, her voice shaking with grief and rage. She vowed, I'll be at every parole hearing, every single one, making sure she never walks free. She continued, holding back tears, before you took their lives, I wanted to write something that said, I hope every night when you close your eyes, they haunt you, but I changed my mind. You don't deserve to see them. They shouldn't have to see you. That same aunt pointed out how much support Tiffany had before everything fell apart, from her own family, from her brother's girlfriend, from people who truly cared. You had a psychotic break because you did, she said bluntly, dismissing any attempts to paint Tiffany as a victim. She called out the tendency to excuse monstrous acts with tragic backstories, addiction, trauma, hardship, reminding everyone that, at the end of the day, Tiffany made the choice to take her sons' lives. You didn't deserve them, she said, and now at least, you can't hurt them anymore. Meanwhile, Tiffany's defense team continued to stand by their story, that she had been detoxing from fentanyl and experienced a drug-induced psychosis, but many observers weren't convinced. They pointed out that just days before the murders, Tiffany had been posting carefully curated photos of her sons on social media, smiling, polished images meant to show a picture-perfect family life. Those posts now felt like a haunting illusion, a desperate attempt to cover the chaos bubbling beneath the surface. Given the brutality of her crime and the attention it received, experts believe Tiffany will face serious challenges in prison. Inmates who harm children often endure relentless hostility behind bars. The nature of her crime, her public profile, and even her demeanor could all affect how she's treated for the rest of her life. This case has left a family shattered and a community in mourning. It's forced many to reflect on all the warning signs that were missed, the erratic behavior, the quiet cries for help, the chances for intervention that slipped. A weight stands as a tragic reminder of how quickly lives can spiral when that intervention never comes, and of the lifelong grief left behind when innocent children become victims of the very person meant to protect them. It was the Christmas season of 1959, a time when joy-filled homes, streets shimmered with lights, and families across America were preparing for the holidays. But for one family in the small town of Osprey, Florida, what should have been a season of love and togetherness became one of the most disturbing murder cases in the state's history. The Walker family, Christine, her husband Cliff, and their two children, 3-year-old Jimmy and 1-year-old Debbie, seemed to have everything a young family could hope for. They lived in a modest but happy home in Sarasota County, surrounded by orange groves and quiet country roads. Christine was known for her kindness, her warmth, and her devotion to her family. Cliff was a hard-working cowboy, tall, wiry, dependable, the kind of man who earned respect just by the way he carried himself. They met back in high school. Two opposites who somehow fit perfectly together, Cliff, with his rugged charm and quiet confidence, and Christine, the bright, outgoing drum major, with the kind of energy that lit up every room she walked into. Together, they built a simple life. It wasn't glamorous, but it was good. They had friends, steady work, and dreams of giving their kids the kind of childhood every parent hopes for, safe, happy, and filled with love. But on December 19th, 1959, all of that came to an end that morning. The Walkers left their home to run a few errands. Christine wanted to get back early to start dinner, while Cliff finished some shopping with the kids when she returned home. The plan was simple: cook, relax, and enjoy a quiet night before Christmas. But instead, she walked straight into a nightmare. According to investigators, Christine came face to face with an intruder, a man who had somehow entered their home. While she was away, what happened next was nothing short of horrifying. Christine was assaulted and then shot to death in her own living room not long after. Cliff returned home with Jimmy and Debbie. What should have been a warm reunion turned into a massacre. The moment Cliff opened the door, the killer attacked, shooting him point blank before turning his weapon on the children. 3-year-old Jimmy was reportedly crawling toward his father when the killer fired again, ending his short life. And little Debbie, her fate was even more gruesome. After being shot, she was drowned in the family bathtub. It was a scene so brutal that even the most hardened investigators were shaken for lives. An entire family wiped out in a matter of minutes. The community of Osprey was paralyzed by fear. No one could understand who could commit such evil. Or with the Walker's relatives and friends were questioned immediately. But nothing made sense. There were no clear motives, no signs of robbery, and no immediate suspects. But then, as the investigation deepened, a chilling connection began to emerge, one that linked this unsolved massacre to one of the most infamous crimes in American history. Just weeks earlier, in November of 1959, a similar family annihilation had taken place, the Clutter family murders in Holcomb, Kansas. That case would go on to inspire Truman Capote's legendary book, In Cold Blood. The crimes shared eerie similarities. Both families were killed in their homes. Both had been shot execution style, and both scenes were left disturbingly personal, as if the killer knew his victims as detectives followed the clues. Two names came up repeatedly: Richard Hickok and Perry Smith, the same men who had murdered the Clutters. Both were already convicted and sentenced to death for the Kansas murders. But evidence hinted they might have been in Florida around the same time the Walkers were killed. The timeline lined up. Hickok and Smith had fled Kansas after the Clutter murders, heading south, reportedly passing through Sarasota County before eventually being arrested in Las Vegas. In the Walker case, investigators discovered a pair of bloody footprints shell casings, and a woman's undergarment, items eerily similar to those found at the Clutter crime scene. There were even reports that Hickok and Smith had tried to buy a car from a local dealership near the Walkers' home for years. Many believed the two men could have been responsible, but there was never enough physical evidence to confirm it then. Decades later, in 2012, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement decided to reopen the case using modern DNA technology. They collected samples from the crime scene and compared them to genetic material from Hickok and Smith. When the results came back, investigators were hopeful, but the tests were inconclusive. The DNA evidence didn't definitively link the men to the murders, but it also didn't rule them out to this day. The Walker family murders remain unsolved. More than 6 decades have passed, yet the case still casts a long, dark shadow over Sarasota County. Families still whisper about it. Old-timers still remember the fear, and true crime enthusiasts continue to search for clues in the smallest details. Who killed the Walkers that December evening? Was it Hickok and Smith, already known for their merciless brutality, or was it someone closer to home? Someone who knew the family's routine and took advantage of their trust. No one knows for sure. What's left is a haunting story of love, innocence, and a Christmas that never came within moments of stepping into her home. Something must have felt off. Maybe it was a sound, a movement, or just a feeling in her gut, but before she could react, she was face to face with her killer. Investigators believed that Christine was caught completely off guard. Still, she didn't go down without a fight. The scene showed clear signs of a struggle: overturned furniture, scuff marks, and Christine's high-heeled shoe found with traces of the attacker's blood on it. She had fought fiercely, using whatever she could to defend herself, but the attacker was relentless. After overpowering her, he shot Christine at close range, ending her life instantly. What happened next remains one of the most haunting mysteries of the case. The killer appeared to have moved her body, deliberately arranging it in the living room. It was as if he wanted the scene to send a message. Or perhaps it was an act of twisted control, a sign that this crime was deeply personal. When Cliff and the children returned home a short time later, they walked straight into the aftermath of that violence. There were no signs they even had a chance to defend themselves. It's likely that Cliff was shot first, possibly the moment he stepped inside, and young Jimmy tried to reach him before being shot as well. Debbie, the youngest, may have been taken into the bathroom afterward, her death by drowning, suggesting the killer wanted to eliminate any witness, no matter how small. What puzzled investigators most was how calm everything outside appeared. The dogs, usually protective and loud, hadn't made a sound that night. This led detectives to believe that the person who came to the Walker home was someone they knew, someone familiar enough for the dogs to trust, and for Christine to open the door to without hesitation. This theory would shape the entire direction of the case in the months and even decades to come, with several witnesses who confirmed he did, in fact, perform that night. But what troubled detectives was the missing hour before dinner, a period that lined up exactly with the estimated time of the murders. When questioned, Tucker became defensive and agitated. He denied ever harming the Walkers and claimed he had no reason to, but his odd fixation on Christine after her death, his proximity to the crime scene, and his lack of a complete alibi made him impossible to rule out. Authorities searched Tucker's property, hoping to find the missing .22 caliber weapon or any trace evidence connecting him to the Walkers. However, nothing solid was recovered. No bloodstains, no clothes, no bullets. Despite this, his behavior continued to draw attention. He reportedly made bizarre comments about the murders, sometimes expressing anger at Christine for ruining his reputation, other times insisting he had been set up. Locals recalled that he would drive by the old Walker home repeatedly after the crime, almost as if he couldn't stay away from the place where it all happened. Eventually, investigators had no choice but to let him go, due to lack of evidence. Still, one detective described Tucker as the one suspect I could never completely shake. But the deeper investigators dug, the stranger the case became. Another lead soon emerged, one that would send the entire investigation in a shocking new direction. Just weeks after the Walker family murders, news broke of another grisly crime hundreds of miles away in Kansas. The Clutter family killings, a quadruple homicide that would later inspire Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. The similarities between the two cases were eerie. Both involved entire families slain in their own homes. Both had been killed by .22 caliber weapons, and both crimes appeared to have been carried out with a disturbing level of cold calculation when two men named Perry Smith and Richard Dick Hickok were arrested and later confessed to the Clutter murders. Florida investigators immediately wondered if they could have been involved in the Walker case as well. After all, Hickok and Smith had reportedly been in Florida shortly before Christmas of 1959, the exact time of the Walker murders. Investigators from Sarasota traveled to Kansas to question the men directly. Hickok and Smith were both placed under intense interrogation about their possible involvement. Hickok at first denied ever hearing of the Walkers, but later admitted that they had talked about killing a family in Florida. Perry Smith, on the other hand, seemed deeply disturbed when the Walkers were mentioned, almost as if something about the case hit too close to home to confirm their suspicions. Authorities conducted ballistics tests on the .22 caliber weapon used in the Clutter murders and compared it to shell casings found at the Walker home. Unfortunately, the results were inconclusive. Then came a new twist. Both men agreed to take polygraph tests according to those results. They were telling the truth when they denied involvement in the Walker killings even so. Some detectives weren't convinced. Their timeline matched, their criminal pattern matched, and their psychological profile, impulsive, violent, and aimless, made them a perfect fit. But without physical evidence, the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office couldn't tie them definitively to the crime. The case once again went cold years later. In 2012, investigators decided to re-examine the evidence with modern forensic technology. They retrieved DNA samples from the clothing and physical evidence found at the Walker home and compared them to the preserved DNA of Smith and Hickok. The results, however, dashed long-held hopes. The DNA tests came back inconclusive, failing to either confirm or eliminate them as exit was a devastating blow to a case that had already haunted the community for over half a century. Despite hundreds of interviews, dozens of suspects, and countless theories, the Walker family murders remain one of Florida's most chilling unsolved mysteries, a tragedy frozen in time, with the truth buried somewhere in the swamps and silence of Potter Palmer Ranch. And for those who still remember the Walkers, Christine, Cliff, Jimmy, and little Debbie, that silence has never truly ended. However, there wasn't enough concrete evidence to back up the woman's claim. Investigators did look into the story and questioned Butch Dennison thoroughly during the interrogation. He denied having any involvement in the Walker family murders and dismissed the allegations as wild gossip meant to ruin his reputation. He insisted he had never even met the Walkers and had no reason to harm them. Still, detectives didn't take his denial at face value. They conducted background checks, searched his property, and interviewed his family and acquaintances to see if anything linked him to the crime. But just like with so many other suspects in the case, the trail went cold. No bloodied boots were ever recovered, and there was no physical evidence connecting Butch or anyone in his family to the brutal killings. With every new suspect came hope that the case was about to break wide open. But time and again, investigators found themselves circling back to the same haunting reality. Too many leads, and not enough proof. Over the years, dozens of people claimed to have information about the Walker murder, some seeking attention, others convinced they had heard a confession, yet every tip led to the same dead end. Despite advancements in forensics and countless rigs, no one has ever been charged with the murders of Cliff, Christine, Jimmy, and little Debbie Walker. Despite the DNA results being inconclusive, investigators still couldn't rule out the possibility that Hickok and Smith were involved. The timing, the similarities in the crime scenes, and their confirmed presence in Florida during that period kept them on the radar. Both the Clutter and Walker murders had a chillingly similar pattern to parents and their children killed execution style inside their homes. No signs of forced entry, and very little evidence left behind. It was as if the killers had perfected their method. Evan Truman Capote, during his research for In Cold Blood, noted how striking the parallels were between the two cases when he questioned the Kansas Bureau of Investigation about it. They admitted that some of the details in the Walker case seemed to mirror the Clutter murders too closely to ignore. Still, without definitive DNA evidence, it was impossible to close the file. By the 2000s, the Walker case had become one of the oldest unsolved family murders in Florida. Detectives who grew up hearing about the tragedy often made it their personal mission to dig through dusty files and old crime scene photos, hoping modern technology might finally reveal the truth. Retired officers, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts alike became fascinated with the mystery, reigniting public interest. Every few years, theories continued to swirl that perhaps the killers were locals, that someone in the community had helped cover it up, or that the case had been mishandled in the rush to find closure. But each lead eventually hit a dead end. Today, the Walker home no longer stands. The land has been repurposed, and only a few aging photographs remain to remind people of the cheerful family that once lived there: Cliff, Christine, and their two young children, Jimmy and Debbie. Their story continues to haunt Osprey, a small, quiet town that has never fully recovered from that December night in 1959. More than 6 decades later, the case remains open, the evidence preserved, in the hopes that one day, with advancements in forensic science, the mystery might finally be solved. Until then, the murders of the Walker family linger as one of Florida's most haunting cold cases, a chilling reminder that sometimes, even in the face of progress and persistence, some secrets remain buried forever. On the morning of November 15, 1959, an unsettling stillness loomed over the quiet town of Holcomb, Kansas. It was a Sunday, and like every week, 2 of Nancy's close friends stopped by the Clutter home to pick her up for church. But something felt different this time. The usually lively house was eerily silent. No one came to the door, and no sound came from inside. After knocking several times and getting no response, the girls grew anxious. One of them decided to peer through a nearby window, and what she saw sent chills down her spine. The Clutter family, known for their kindness and generosity, had been brutally murdered in their own home. The news of the crime tore through the small farming town like a wildfire. No one could believe that such horror had found its way into a community where people rarely even locked their doors. Police arrived shortly after and were met with a grisly scene that would forever scar those who entered. The house in the basement. Herbert Clutter was found lying on a mattress, his throat slit, and his body bound. Nearby was his teenage son, Kenyon, tied up and shot upstairs. Bonnie and Nancy had also been bound and shot to death. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, and no apparent motive. The crime shocked the nation, not just because of its brutality, but because it seemed so random. The Clutters were beloved members of their community, with no known enemies. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, and the family was known for their generosity rather than greed. It was as though the killers had come for something far darker than money. As investigators combed through the house, they pieced together a timeline of that fateful night. Sometime after midnight, 2 men entered the home through an unlocked door. They were looking for a safe. A rumor had spread that Herbert Clutter kept a large sum of cash hidden in the house, but that safe didn't exist. When they realized there was no money, their frustration turned deadly. Herbert tried to reason with them, offering the little cash he had, but it wasn't enough. In a fit of rage, one of the men killed him. Then, methodically, they moved through the house, executing each family member one by one. News of the massacre reached every corner of America, and within days, the story became a national obsession. It wasn't just a murder, It was the shattering of the American dream. The clutters represented everything wholesome and good about small-town life, and their violent deaths made people question how safe they really were in their own homes. Among those captivated by the case was a writer named Truman Capote. He saw in the story something more than tragedy. He saw a window into the human psyche, both of the victims and the killers. So he set out to Kansas, determined to uncover the truth behind the murders that would later inspire his groundbreaking book. In cold blood, pursuit came to a dead end. There was simply no one with a motive strong enough to kill the Clutters. Herbert was known as a fair, honest man, respected by his employees, admired by his neighbors, and trusted by everyone in Holcomb. He had no enemies, no debts, and no shady dealings that could explain such savagery. Detectives scoured the home for any clue, any trace of the killer's identities. They carefully dusted for fingerprints, examined every room, and collected the shell casings found near the bodies. The only tangible evidence they had were those worn-out boot prints near Nancy's bed, the same kind used by or drifters, but with no fingerprints and no witnesses. The case quickly grew cold. The brutality of the murders left the town paralyzed with fear. People who had once left their doors unlocked began bolting them shut. Neighbors eyed each other with quiet suspicion, wondering if the killer might be someone among them. Holcomb, once a peaceful farming town, had become a place of dread and distrust over Nitas. The investigation continued. Law enforcement followed every possible lead. They questioned workers who had recently been employed by Herbert, checked out local and even tracked down traveling salesmen who had passed through the area. But nothing, not a single lead, brought them closer to the truth. Rumors began to swirl. Some whispered that the murders must have been professional, carried out by hired killers. Others were convinced it was a robbery gone wrong, but that theory didn't hold up either. The only things missing were a portable radio and a pair of binoculars. Hardly items worth killing for innocent people over 4 weeks. The case seemed unsolvable, but hundreds of miles away, in a Kansas prison, 2 men, Perry Smith and Richard Dick Hickok, were quietly laying the groundwork for what would become one of the most infamous connections in American true crime history. Hick, who had previously served time for passing bad checks, had learned about the Clutters from a former cellmate the man had once worked for, Herbert Clutter, and told Hickok that the wealthy farmer kept thousands of dollars locked away in a safe at home. What Hickok didn't know, and what would later seal the Clutters' fate, was that no such safe existed. To find the supposed fortune, Hickok teamed up with Perry Smith, a drifter with a violent streak and a troubled past. Together, they decided to rob the Clutter home, but when they broke in and found nothing, frustration turned to rage, and that rage led to murder. What began as a simple robbery soon spiraled into one of the most senseless and devastating crimes in Kansas history, leaving behind a shattered community and a haunting mystery that would soon capture the attention of the entire nation. Up the entire Clutter family, force Mr. Clutter to open the safe, take the money, and then kill everyone to leave. No witnesses behind. Floyd laughed at first, thinking Hickok was joking. Prison talk often included wild fantasies that never left the cell walls, but as days went by, Hickok's tone grew darker and more deliberate. He wasn't fantasizing. He was planning. He talked about how he'd drive to Holcomb, Kansas. Once he was out on parole, he'd bring Perry with him, someone he described as a tough guy with nerves of steel. Hickok bragged that Perry was the perfect partner, small, quiet, and ruthless when he needed to be. They'd rob the Clutter, disappear, and live large in Mexico with the cash. Hickok even drew a map of the farm from Floyd's descriptions and repeated over and over that it was an easy job. Floyd warned him that the Clutters weren't the kind of people to cross. They were good, church-going folks who didn't keep piles of cash lying around. But Hickok didn't listen. He was convinced that safe full of money was real. When Hickok was finally paroled, he promised Floyd he'd be back soon, richer than ever. Floyd thought little of it at the time, but a few months later, When news spread through the prison that a whole family in Holcomb had been murdered, his stomach turned. The Clutter name was in the headlines. It couldn't be a coincidence Hickok had done it, and Perry must have helped for days. Floyd wrestled with what to do. He feared being labeled a snitch inside prison, which could mean a beating or worse, but the guilt of staying silent about an innocent family's murder began eating him alive. Finally, when he saw the newspaper's $1,000 reward, he decided to come forward. He told investigators everything: the conversations, the drawings, the plan, the names Hickok and Perry Edward Smith. The detectives were stunned after weeks of hitting dead ends. They finally had their first real leads. The next step was to verify if these two ex-cons were even out of prison, and, if so, where they had gone. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation quickly confirmed that both Richard Dick Hickok and Perry Smith had been released earlier that year. What's more, Hickok had been spotted driving a black 1949 Chevrolet, a car that witnesses in Holcomb recalled seeing near the Clutter property. The night of the murders, investigators now had their suspects, but tracking them down wouldn't be easy. By the time the KBA assembled arrest warrants, Hickok and Perry were already long gone, heading south across the border. The two men had spent the days after the murder drifting across Kansas and Texas, writing bad checks, pawning stolen goods, and talking about their big score. When they realized there was no safe in the Clutter home, and no cash to be found, their rage had driven them to kill. They slaughtered the family for nothing now. They were in Mexico, broke, drinking, and arguing. Perry wanted to stay in Mexico and forget everything, but Hickok wanted to return to the U.S. and keep making money through scams. Their partnership began to fracture back in Kansas. Investigators released photos of the two men nationwide. The story spread fast. Newspapers across America printed their mugshots with the chilling headline, "Clutter Family Killers at Large." The manhunt was on, but catching Hickok and Perry would take weeks, and a trail of bad checks, gas receipts, and random sightings would lead detectives across 2 countries before they finally closed in. Hickok's plan was simple but horrifying: break into the Clutter home, tie everyone up, and shoot them to leave no witnesses. Floyd didn't think much of it at the time in prison. Men often talked big to sound tough or impress others, and Hickok's words seemed like just another piece of jailhouse bravado. But that illusion shattered one night as Floyd lay in his cell, listening to the radio. The news anchor's voice broke the silence. A Kansas family named Clutter had been brutally murdered. In their home. Floyd froze. His heart pounded as he realized the story matched exactly what Hickok had described months earlier. Still, he stayed quiet. The fear of being branded a snitch inside prison was too great. That label could get him killed for days. He tried to ignore it, but the guilt gnawed at him when he heard that authorities were offering a $1,000 reward for any information leading to the killers. The temptation grew stronger, yet, even then, he hesitated. Not only out of fear, but also because he worried that confessing might make him look like an accomplice. After all, he was the one who had unknowingly told Hickok about the Clutter family and the supposed revenge. Floyd couldn't bear it any longer. He confided in a fellow inmate, a deeply religious man whom he trusted. That inmate came up with a plan to get Floyd called to the warden's office without raising suspicion. It would look like Floyd was in trouble for breaking a rule, not for providing information. The next day, Floyd was escorted to the warden's office. There, he finally told his story about Hickok, Perry Smith, and their plan to rob and kill the Clutters. 10 days later, investigators confirmed everything. Floyd had, indeed, worked for the Clutter family a decade earlier, and the two men he named, Richard Dick Hickok and Perry Edward Smith, were both real, complete with detailed criminal records and mugshots. The police finally knew who they were looking for. What they didn't know was where they had gone. To understand who these killers were, it helps to look at their lives before the murders. Richard Eugene Dick Hickok was born in Kansas City to hard-working farm parents. As the eldest child, he was talented and full of promise, a natural athlete who excelled at baseball, basketball, and football. He got good grades and dreamed of studying engineering in college, but his family couldn't afford the tuition. Instead, he took a job with the Santa Fe Railway and, at just 19, married a 16-year-old girl named Carol. They rented a small house, bought a nice car, and began building a life together for a while. Things looked bright. Hickok worked driving ambulances, then shifted to fixing and painting cars. Jobs that suited his skill and charm, but everything changed after a devastating car accident. His vehicle flipped over and landed upside down in a ditch filled with water. He was pulled out moments before drowning, but the crash left him with a severe head injury. From that point on, everyone noticed a difference. His once handsome face became slightly distorted, one eye drooping lower than the other, but worse was the change in his personality. He became restless, impulsive, and reckless, his father later said. He just wasn't the same boy after that. Hickok's life spiraled. He started gambling, writing bad checks, and having affairs eventually. He left his wife and 3 children for an older mistress when money ran out. He turned to theft, stealing guns and trying to sell them for quick cash. Eventually, his crimes caught up with him, landing him in Kansas State Penitentiary. That's where he met Floyd Wells and later became friends with another inmate who would change his life forever, Perry Smith. Perry Edward Smith's story couldn't have been more different. Born in Huntington, Nevada, 2 rodeo performers, Tex and Flo. He grew up in chaos. His father was Irish, his mother Cherokee, and his early years were filled with violence and instability. In 1929, the family moved to Alaska, where his father began brewing illegal whiskey and beating his wife eventually. Flo fled with the children to San Francisco, but life didn't get better. She fell deep into alcoholism, and at just 8 years old, Perry had his first run-in with the law when he was 13. Tragedy struck again. His mother drank herself to death, choking on her own vomit. After that, Perry and his siblings were sent to orphanages and state institutions, where he endured brutal physical and emotional abuse. By his late teens, Perry was reunited with his father, and the two drifted across the western United States trying to survive. Perry turned to petty theft to get by. With no education and no real direction, he enlisted in the army and fought in the Korean War. He was tough, but his temper and rebellious streak often got him into trouble. He spent time in the stockade for fighting with other soldiers. After his discharge, Perry used his pay to buy a motorcycle, but not long after, he crashed it in a terrible accident that left him hospitalized for 6 months. The crash shattered both his legs, leaving him in constant pain and dependent on medication for the rest of his life. By 1956, Perry's crimes had escalated: grand larceny, jailbreak, car theft, and he found himself back behind bars at the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing. That's where he met Dick Hickok. The two became close. Some said inseparable. Hickok admired Perry's quiet toughness. Perry was drawn to Hickok's confidence and charm. It was a dangerous combination, one that would soon lead to one of the most senseless and haunting murders in American history. Perry Smith was released from prison in early 1959, and not long after, in November of the same year, Richard Dick Hickok also regained his freedom. The moment Hickok got out, he wasted no time reaching out to his old prison friend. He wrote to Perry, urging him to break parole and return to Kansas. Hickok had been planning a big robbery, his so-called score, and he wanted Perry by his side inside prison. Perry had once bragged about killing a man, a story most inmates dismissed as tough talk, but Hickok believed him. He trusted Perry completely, and was convinced that his friend wouldn't hesitate to kill if it meant getting what they wanted. At the time, Perry was living with his father in Reno after being paroled, but their relationship quickly soured. Restless and without direction, Perry drifted to Las Vegas for a while. When Hickok's letter arrived, Perry saw it as a way to start over, or perhaps to escape the aimless life he was living. He headed for Kansas City to reunite with another ex-con he knew, but he missed him by only a few hours soon after. He finally caught up with Hickok once reunited. Hickok wasted no time laying out his plan. The two men bought supplies, including a shotgun, gloves, and rope, and began their journey west to Holcomb, Kansas, to the Clutter family farm in the night of November 14, 1959. Hickok and Perry entered the Clutter home through an unlocked door. They expected to find a safe full of cash, just as Hickok had imagined from Floyd Wells' old stories, but there was no safe, no money. Nothing worth stealing yet by the time they left. 4 innocent people were dead. The Clutter family had been murdered for absolutely nothing after the killings. Hickok and Perry drove to Kansas City. Hickok briefly worked at an auto paint shop, but quit within days on November 21st. He attempted to cash a bad check for $192 at a camera store. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation (KBI) soon began piecing together their movements when they interviewed Hickok's parents. They learned that Dick and Perry had claimed to be traveling to Fort Scott on November 14th to visit one of Perry's sisters the next day. They returned home for lunch before heading back to Kansas City. Investigators searched Hickok's home and found several suspicious items: a bloody shirt hidden in a drawer, and a shotgun Hickok had recently purchased. While gun ownership wasn't unusual in Kansas, the KBI knew these clues were significant after passing more bad checks and pawning items stolen from the Clutters, including a radio and binoculars. The two men fled to Mexico. They sold their getaway car there. But life south of the border wasn't what they expected. They quickly ran out of money and decided to return to the U.S., planning to commit more crimes to fund their escape to Brazil, a country they mistakenly believed wouldn't extradite them. 31 days after the murders, Hickok and Perry crossed the border back into the States. They mailed most of their belongings to Las Vegas to travel light and hitchhike undetected along the way. They stole another car in Iowa and eventually returned to Kansas City. Hickok immediately went back to his old habits, writing bad checks within a few days. He had passed more than $500 worth of fraudulent payments. On December 16th, a Kansas furniture store reported a man using bad checks to buy a television. The KBI arrived quickly, and employees identified Hickok from a photo lineup around the same time. A gas station attendant also recognized him after another bad check attempt, with the net closing in. Hickok and Perry fled south again, driving to Miami, Florida, where they spent Christmas together. They sold the items they had bought with fake checks and continued their chaotic road trip across the country, working odd jobs for quick cash. By early January 1960, they made their way to Las Vegas. Still driving the stolen car from Iowa, they picked up the belongings they had mailed ahead of time, but by then, police had traced the car's stolen registration when officers finally stopped the pair. A search of the vehicle revealed 2 pairs of boots in the trunk, one with a cat's paw sole and the other with a diamond tread pattern. Those prints matched exactly the bloody footprints found at the Clutter murder scene. It was the break the police had been waiting for. In fact, if officers had stopped the men just an hour earlier, they might not have found the boots at all. A stroke of pure luck that tied the killers directly to the crime. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation quickly flew to Las Vegas to interrogate the suspects. Hickok, known for being talkative and confident, was the first to be questioned. Perry, in contrast, was quiet and detached, almost emotionless. The investigators started casually, asking Hickok about the bad checks, but soon, the questions turned serious. They told him they had solid evidence placing him and Perry at the Clutter home the night of the murders. Hickok's charm began to crack under pressure. Finally, he asked if there was any chance of a lighter sentence, maybe manslaughter. If he confessed, then he blurted out, "I never pulled the trigger. I didn't know what the hell was going on. I was in the other room when it started." He pinned the blame squarely on Perry Smith, while Perry sat silently, refusing to say a word, his cold stare giving away nothing. 1965. At the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, the execution took place just after midnight. Hickok went first. He appeared calm, almost detached, as if still convinced something would save him at the last moment. But when the black hood was placed over his head and the trapdoor opened, the illusion shattered a few minutes later. It was Perry Smith's turn. He looked pale, visibly nervous, yet oddly at peace. Before the hood came down, he softly said, "I think it's a hell of a thing to take a life. Even your own." The room fell silent moments later. The floor beneath him dropped, and the Clutter murders finally reached their grim conclusion. News of their execution spread quickly across the country. Reporters described the scene in detail, from the ticking of the clock in the death chamber to the eerie quiet that followed. Public opinion was split. Some saw justice finally served, while others questioned whether the death penalty truly brought closure for the people of Holcomb, Kansas. The wounds left by that November night never fully healed. The Clutter family had been symbols of safety, faith, and small-town decency. Their brutal deaths shattered that sense of security forever. The house where it all happened still stood for years, silent, empty, and avoided by locals who couldn't bear to drive past it. As for Floyd Wells, the inmate who had first tipped off authorities, he received a small portion of the reward money and was quietly paroled not long after. But he lived with guilt for the rest of his life, knowing that a casual prison conversation had led to killers to the doorstep of a kind, innocent family. And Truman Capote, the journalist who chronicled the case in cold blood, immortalized the tragedy, turning it into one of the most haunting true crime stories ever told through his book. The world came to see the Clutter murders not just as a crime, but as a chilling reflection of the darkness that can lurk in the human soul. Ambition, desperation, cruelty, and loss. The legacy of that night in Holcomb remains a chilling reminder. Sometimes evil doesn't come from monsters in the dark. It comes from ordinary men who convince themselves they deserve more than life ever gave them. He was pronounced dead at 12:41 a.m., followed by Perry Smith at 1:19 a.m. The brutal murders of the Clutter family, committed for barely $50 worth of goods, left a scar that time could never erase. But the story didn't end there. Decades later, both Hickok and Smith's bodies were exhumed as investigators tried to solve another unspeakable mystery, the cold case of the Walker family murders. On December 19, 1959, Cliff and Christine Walker, along with their 2 young children, 3-year-old Jimmy and 1-year-old Debbie, were found shot to death in their home in Osprey, Florida. Christine had also been sexually assaulted at that time. Hickok and Smith were known to be in Florida, spending Christmas just miles away from where the Walkers were killed. They were questioned and even given polygraph tests, which cleared them back then, but those results would never meet modern investigative standards. Hoping for definitive proof, authorities exhumed their remains decades later to collect DNA samples and compare them to evidence from the Walker crime scene. By August 2014, the results came in inconclusive. The DNA from the skeletal remains was too degraded, and the evidence from Christine Walker too contaminated to produce a match. The mystery endures. Hickok and Smith remained prime suspects, yet they cannot be definitively tied or cleared from the Walkers' tragic death sentence. The rain falls softly, and the night deepens. Thank you for joining me here at Crime Whisper. True crime stories remind us that even in peaceful places, shadows linger, and the truth sometimes sleeps beneath them.